The phone call. On June the 5th, the presidents of the world's top two economies spoke on the phone. According to China's official news agency Xinhua, Chinese President Xi Jinping welcomed US President Donald Trump to visit China again, for which the latter expressed heartfelt appreciation, quote unquote. Both sides, of course, discussed trade issues, especially what to do to follow through on the agreement they reached in Geneva, Switzerland on May the 12th. The call came amid repeated U.S. accusations that China has not followed through on its promises when it comes to relaxing controls over rare earth, the minerals essential for high-tech products. What exactly did the two presidents talk about? What signals are they sending to each other and to the watching world? And amid the smoke and mirrors of political signaling, what can we expect? The return of tariff escalation or the Trumps posing in front of the Temple of Heaven? Welcome to this special edition of The Point, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Joining us from Shanghai, Professor Zhang Xiaotong of Political Science and International Relations at Kimep University of Almaty, Kazakhstan. From New York, Anthony Chen, Global Chief Economist at Chen Economics and former Global Chief Economist at JP Morgan Chase. From Beijing, Chris Torrance, Managing Director of Greater China of APCO and Independent Strategic Advisory and Vice Chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in China. And from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Vitelio Brustolin, Professor of International Relations at Fluminense Federal University and a researcher at Harvard University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. First of all, let's talk about the phone call which happened just hours ago. Now, according to the Chinese official news agency Xinhua, Xi said the Chinese always honor and deliver what has been promised, urging both sides to make good on the agreement reached in Geneva. In fact, China has been seriously and earnestly executing the agreement, Xi added. The US side should also acknowledge the progress already made and remove the negative measures taken against China, he said. Now, let me go to Professor Zhang. What's the significance of this phone call, the first between the two presidents after President Trump came into office again?
Thank you, Liu Xin. I think it's a very important phone call in the sense that the two leaders haven't met each other for 5 months. So this phone call meeting, really sends a strong signal to the rest of the world, and including China and the United States, that trade agreement is within reach. And the top leaders of both largest economies are very serious about this trade deal. And both China and the United States will work closely to make sure all the agreed will be implemented accordingly.
Anthony, what is your read on the purpose of this phone call? I mean, we have just talked about the context of this phone call where the United States has repeatedly accused China of even totally violating the terms of the Geneva Agreement. What is your read of the purpose of the phone call and why now?
I think the purpose was a constructive one because I think most people will agree that the relationship between China and the United States did hit a soft patch. There were some rocky developments between both countries as both countries took steps that were contrary to the interests of the other. And so this call was important to put the negotiations back on track. I think the United States expressed a real strong desire to have these rare earth minerals and magnets again starting to be exported by China. And of course, China made a very good point that for the United States to take measures that China felt were not in their best interest, were not constructive towards the trade negotiations. So I think there was a good meeting of the mind between both countries. My suspicion is that negotiations will remain tough, but they're going to move in the right direction from here.
Mr. Chris Torrance, observing from your end, especially the business community in the UK and, even on a wider scope, what is your read of the messages and signals coming out of this conversation? Is it a good sign that probably shows the two countries despite the mutual accusations, the back and forth, that they remain committed? How much faith can we put in what's being said across the Pacific?
Thanks, Liu Shen, and it's great to be back on the program again. So thanks for the invitation. Yeah, just to say, I mean, I think I'm reflecting the views of APCO's clients, the majority of whom are US based, although I'm a British national myself. So I do have a UK perspective as well. And I know there's been a lot of talk about the phone call and, who started it and, what does it mean for the world? I think the most important thing is that the two sides are talking again. I completely agree with Professor Zhang and Anthony's comments just now. The reality is both sides need each other. Both sides need to keep their economies on track. The US needs Chinese manufacturing, it needs Chinese products, consumers. China needs US technology, needs US consumers. And actually the timing is quite good as well, because we have a new US ambassador to China, David Perdue, who has been injecting just over the last few days much needed positivity and reassurance to the US business community in China through meetings with US business associations. So I think the timing's great, and like the other speakers, I'm hopeful that this leads to something substantive.
Mr. Vitelio Brustolin in Brazil, one thing that we noticed is what the Chinese official news agency reported, quoting China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Of course, it's the same messages that they're sending, that President Xi welcomed Trump to visit China again, for which Trump expressed heartfelt appreciation. What is your comments on this piece of information? What does that tell us? Because if you read the White House statement, actually, it says the other way, extended invitation to the Chinese side as well. The discrepancy apart, even just the Chinese, revealing that China extended an invitation to President Trump to visit China again. What does that tell us at this moment?
Well, thank you for having me. I think this is a very important move, a diplomatic move. Trump made the first move in this conversation. He wanted to have the conversation. He asked for that. It was a 90 minutes long conversation, and it's a good time for this kind of discussion about the commerce and also the visa of the students, of Chinese students in US. It's clear that China is more prepared this time than in the first mandate of Trump, because in the first mandate, people don't remember that, but in the first mandate by 2020, there was an agreement between the US and China. And the agreement was that China would increase the importations from the US by $200 billion. No one remembers that because it was in January 2020, it was before the pandemic. But this time, China is much more prepared. We can see by the travel of Xi Jinping through Southeast Asia, for example, to Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia. And during the first mandate of Trump, China used to export 25% of its products to the US. Right now, the share is between 12 and 15%. China is diversifying the exportations, and Trump can see that very well right now, Xin.
So despite the dwindling reliance on the US market, China does place a lot of importance. That's my read of trade with the United States. And President Xi, in the beginning of the program, from the quote, also said that China takes this very seriously, and China has seriously and earnestly executed the agreement. However, there have been repeated accusations on the U.S. part about China not doing that. So let's take a quick timeline. We took the time to find out exactly what happened, and here it is. Bear with me a little bit. On May the 13th, which is a day after the Geneva Agreement, the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security publishes guidelines warning companies around the world against using Huawei advanced chips. And then a couple of days, 2 weeks later, on May the 28th, the US announced plans to aggressively revoke visas for Chinese students. Almost at exactly the same time, it is reported by the Financial Times and other media that the Trump administration is telling U.S. chip design software makers to halt China sales. On May the 30th, the day after President Trump accused China of totally violating the agreement reached in Geneva. On June the 2nd, AmCham president says China isn't blocking rare earth exports. That's according to a Bloomberg report. China is taking the measures, but the process takes time. Basically, on June the 3rd, China rejects the repeated U.S. claims that China is violating the consensus. So, and now we have this phone call. That's a very rough outline of what has happened. Professor Zhang, how do you look at this timeline? Exactly what are we seeing? Are the two sides engaging with each other in following through the Geneva Agreement, or what has been going on?
Indeed, the two sides are engaging, but the trust between each other is very thin. So they are engaging, but with insufficient political trust. So I think this phone call is extremely timely to send signals to both sides, to the both domestic territories, that the United States and China needs to rebuild political trust, and all the following measures need to follow through so as to restore the good atmosphere in which this agreement could be implemented. So that's my view. And actually, during Obama's time, I was working in the Ministry of Commerce, China. So at the times, China and the United States granted each other 10-year-long multiple entry visa.
Right.
And Obama administration promoted the so-called 100,000 plus student exchange program with China. And China did something similarly. So at the time, there was trust, but now the trust was gone. So it's time to restore the trust.
Anthony, looking at the measures, for instance, the guidance against using Huawei chips, a very sensitive topic, just to mention Huawei, and then aggressively revoke visas for Chinese students and asking chip companies to, halt their sales or revoking license of some of the suppliers that are already in place. Is that helpful, really, to build the kind of trust that's much needed, that's already been much depleted?
That's a very good point. I agree with Professor Zhang that there were some steps taken by the United States that were viewed as being hostile in nature. And so that really withered the trust between the United States and China. Specifically on the Chinese side, those steps were viewed as exhibiting a lack of good faith. My dad grew up in China, in Guangzhou, and he always told me growing up that to the Chinese is very important to save face. And so when you see these steps that are viewed as exhibiting bad faith, there are going to be some counter moves. And I think that the United States felt that the Chinese were not proceeding fast enough with the rare earth metals. And of course, the Chinese felt that those steps were viewed as hostile in nature. So with that lack of trust, this phone call was absolutely essential. And I hope that moving forward, that both parties understand that taking steps that are perceived by the other side as being of a bad faith nature are counterproductive and will not help to further the trade negotiations.
Yeah, Chris Torrance, I think Anthony touched upon something very important, and that's actually quite puzzling, the way how different cultures approach this issue. The United States seems to think, okay, we can have a very clear line between what we agreed on and what we want to do. If we didn't agree on not to do certain things, we are going to move ahead, good or bad. However you perceive it, we're going to do these things. Whereas the Chinese say, if you are really in good faith of working with me, you're not going to harm me outside this agreement, and the ink is still fresh on this piece of paper.
Yeah, I think it's worth looking not just at the US-China relationship, because this isn't unique to US-China negotiations. We could look at US-Europe as well. And I'm not going to comment on US government negotiation tactics, except to say that it's very different to what we're used to. And sometimes the message is somewhat justified. I mean, look at J.D. Vance's, the Vice President's visit to Europe and his message to European NATO members that they need to contribute more to defense. This was met with sort of shock and horror, not because of the message. I think the message was justified, but the tone and the delivery was extremely confrontational. And Trump is threatening to impose 50% tariffs on EU imports on 9th of July unless a deal is reached. So it's very much the way the US administration and Trump personally does business. So this is sort of transactional nature in this business element. I think the other point we need to remember is the optics of Trump's negotiations with China vis-a-vis his domestic political agenda. He needs a deal. The US needs a deal. They need that for the economy. But Trump needs to have it in a way that makes him look like he's the successful businessman. I think that's the reality that we need to remember. And obviously that's a shock for all economies, large or small, that are dealing with the US at the moment.
And the whole Chinese population is watching too, right? If they're watching the news and they're seeing that the US doing this and that to China, and then what's going on? Then what about the popular support for continuing to engage with the United States when they're continuing harming us? Mr. Bruce Tollin, what do you think of this? I mean, if you look at this agreement that they reached in Geneva, actually it's just one A4 paper, and it's very simple. Basically, first the preamble, or what they recognize, what are some of the general principles, the general atmosphere between the two sides, and then what they commit to do. Although it doesn't specifically prevent the US from taking other measures against China, like the one I listed, it does say the two sides recognize the importance of a sustainable, long-term, and mutually beneficial economic and trade relationship. That is like one of the underlying conditions upon which the two sides reached this agreement. What do you think that is being taken adequately, seriously?
Well, there is almost a consensus between the economists that the US can't produce everything it needs inside the country right now. For example, an iPhone that costs around $1,000 would cost $3,500 if it was produced inside the US. So it's clear that China has some advantage here. Also, I think China is taking some time because China is watching what Trump is doing, watching the visa problem, watching what will happen after these 90 days of freezing tariffs, because we need to remember it will expire by August. So China is watching also what Trump is doing with Ukraine, because there was agreement between US and Ukraine about the rare earth minerals between the two countries, but the US can't use those minerals during the war. And since we will not have peace between Russia and Ukraine anytime soon, Trump knows that he needs China and the minerals. So China is using this card to negotiate. It's taking some time, going slowly to watch what Trump is doing, Xin.
Okay, this is your opinion, which is really interesting, because the president of AmCham in China actually doesn't agree with that. He said on record that China isn't blocking rare earth, and I quote here, he said, "We are seeking some approvals. We are seeing some approvals come through, certainly slower than industry would like," said Michael Hart, president of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. Some of the delay, he said, is related to China working through their new system to approve exports, not that they are not allowing exports. Professor Zhang, what is your take on what's really happening here?
I think that China is committed to what China has agreed. And China would surely implement this, what China has committed to, but with the condition that the United States would have good faith in reciprocate. So in other words, this Geneva Agreement has agreed to set up a mechanism. I think this mechanism serves as a negotiating platform So both parties could negotiate through this platform. And I think that the United States should demonstrate good faith in visa issue, in chip issue, so as to have a level playing field to restore the political trust with China.
Very interesting. You mentioned the channel for communication. The Geneva Agreement actually does say that the two sides, reflecting on their recent discussions and believing that continued discussions have the potential to address the concerns of each side in their economic and trade relationship. But obviously, the White House doesn't consider some of the issues they are addressing economic and trade issues, such as visa, Chinese students, such as the chip design software. Mr. Chris Anthony, let me come to you. Is there a way really to get the talks back on track, or is there any possibility that the United States understand the sensitivity of the issues concerning high technology, the software, the chips, and the student? If the United States are going to have the Chinese cooperate closely, they are going to talk to the Chinese to address their concern and not just roll out these unilateral measures one after another, leaving probably the Chinese very little space to maneuver but to react in public and aggressively.
My hope and expectation is that when you have these kinds of talks between both of the top leaders in the United States and in China, that understanding goes across. The pressure in the United States is that right now, a lot of the auto companies are saying that they're having to be very close to shutting down production because those rare magnets or rare earth minerals are not coming through fast enough. I have no doubt that there is a strong possibility that there are frictions in China and that there's a process and it's going to take a little bit longer. But in the United States, the president is getting pressure from a lot of these auto companies to get these rare earth metals so that they don't have to shut down production. So the perception is that somehow the Chinese are not moving fast enough. On the Chinese side, those steps that you've described are not helpful. There is very little incentive for the Chinese to accelerate the process beyond its normal process.
And let's not forget
to help the United States.
Let's not forget the rare earth restrictions were put in retaliation of Trump's so-called Revolution Day. They were put in place because of Trump's tariffs on China.
Right. No, I think we're in agreement. I'm just telling you that in the U.S. there's a lot of pressure, but at the same time, if the United States wants China to go above and beyond to speed up the process, they have to show some goodwill. And so far, I don't think the Chinese have seen any goodwill from the United States.
Chris, is there a way that you can suggest as a strategic advisory for your clients to stay put, to stay cool and navigate through this very difficult period of time? What do you think can be done given this kind of situation, this kind of reality we're talking about?
So for our clients, most of them have been here as long as I have, for decades, and they see China as an integral part of their overall businesses. So we don't see any significant movement there at all. I would say that I feel what we're seeing now with the negotiations is again part of the Trump playbook. And I think there is a certain amount of bullying. And as I said, culturally, it's very difficult to deal with. This is completely different from how governments have talked to each other in the past. And when government leaders historically have met, the agreement's already been made. There may be like a little bit that gets agreed over dinner the following evening or something, but essentially the deal is done. The problem with the current US administration is that there is no certainty, there is no stability, there is no consistency. And so it's difficult to see where we're going. Ultimately, I think if we do refer to the Trump playbook, we're likely to see a ratcheting up of tensions, more of this pressure, all of which are self-inflicting wounds. I mean, to revoke the visas of 277,000 Chinese students in the US is ultimately self-inflicting it's a wound inflicted on the US. But I think what we can hope for is that the Trump administration will move towards what could be a big, beautiful deal. We don't know what it'll be called, but it'll be something that Trump pulls out of the hat, and only he, as the great businessman, can can affect this. So I think that's what we're aiming for. That's our best case scenario that we're hoping for.
Yeah. Mr. Bruce Tollin, to have a real deal, remember we're in a truce, right? It's temporary. Things can go in different directions. So what really has to be understood for President Trump, for his team, and for the people who have so much support for him when negotiating with the Chinese, what not to do?
That's an interesting question because right now no one trusts the American government. And it's sad to say that because the US used to have a government based in trustworthy. During 80 years, the US was responsible for the security of Europe. It was a mutual agreement between the two sides of the Atlantic. But right now, it's impossible to trust in the commerce and in the security, even in the tourism and for a study in the US, it's been hard. So I believe China should diversify the partners. Maybe China could look at Europe. At this moment, Europe is looking for partners like South America, Mercosur. There is agreement between European Union and Mercosur that is about to be signed by the countries of European Union.
Yeah, basically you're saying the world is moving on, so better wake up and see the reality and catch it before the carriage is gone. Am I saying it correctly?
New partnerships.
Yeah, new partnerships being forged, and not just beginning. It's long been in the making. Time to wake up, probably. Anyway, I just want to wrap up with this message from President Xi. According to Xinhua, to President Donald Trump, China has been seriously and earnestly executing the agreement. The U.S. side should acknowledge the progress already made and remove the negative measures taken against China. I think these are very sincere words, and hope they are heeded. No time left. We have to leave it there. Many thanks for my guests for sharing with us very important insights on this important issue. Zhang Xiaotong, Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Kimep University. Anthony Chen, Global Chief Economist at Chen Economics and former Global Chief Economist at JP Morgan Chase. Chris Torrance, Managing Director of Greater China of APCO and Independent Strategic Advisory and Vice Chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in China. And Vitelio Bruce Tollin, Professor of International Relations at Fluminense Federal University and a researcher at Harvard University. With that, we wrap up this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.